Yeah, and introduce everyone. So Anna, what have you learned this week?
Now I have to think. I have to, I'm gonna go later.
Hello everyone, and it's great to see, the beautiful thing about the Unlearning Hour is we don't know who's going to turn up, and that's the beautiful thing, and just so grateful to see new faces, old faces, the faces of each week. I've actually just come straight from a panel at a conference on disability and art education that was about something that we've talked about in this panel, in this sessions before, about residential and boarding school survivors. And this was an intersection between people with intellectual disability and Indigenous survivors from schools in Canada. And I was one of the organizers, but I didn't say anything. And I felt that was, I know that my co-organizer wanted me to talk, but I just, there was nothing that I could say in relation to what was being presented. And we had technical difficulties, and the survivor that we engaged with, Joe Clayton, was not able to tell his whole story, given to the technical difficulties, which was a shame. But we did get to hear about his art making as a process of healing for him. And so, but I think that was the thing, and I'm learning this element of my personality many times, which is feeling like, and I have actually Indigo to thank for some of this thinking, which is, you can still be involved with organizing and hosting something without organizing and hosting in an active kind of way that controls things. So I'm coming fresh from an unlearning moment. So I'm just kind of flush with it right now, and I'll shut up and let someone else share.
I was just telling everybody before you came, Richard, well, my name is Alcira Dueñas for everyone. And I haven't met Jared, and I saw Anna and Indigo in a previous meeting, but I teach at Newark history, Indigenous, colonial, intellectual history. And I was precisely mentioning that there's more information coming about this whole issue of the land grant, grab universities, long history, right? It's been really amazing to see how much more we learn or unlearn every time that we hear from this at the university, and also the website that you shared, Richard, High Country, I believe. It's an amazing place to go and find a lot of information. And I wanted to share, if you don't know it already, but there was a documentary that came out about 10 years ago. This is about, it's actually a visual poem, I believe, about the transformation of Indian country over the years, and particularly focused on Georgia, and how thousands and thousands of acres of indigenous land became more and more county lands, and the lines begin to change, and the deep geography of the area begins to change. So I just wanted to recommend, if you are interested, let me share I have a link to the documentary, actually to a link to a trailer of the documentary, which I'm pasting here. I really recommend it to you because it's a really deep geography of indigenous land in the case of Georgia. And it's very poetic as well, and very, very nicely very nicely structured history of the land. It's not exactly about the land grants, land grab issue, but it's tightly connected to the laws of indigenous land, and the separation and the segregation of indigenous peoples in the land. So it's the link. Did I show the link? The link is down, it's right there. That's a link to the trailer. Maybe some of you know it. It's called General Orders Number 9. It's an amazing, amazing visual essay, poetry, strong criticism about the loss of Indian land to the cities and the formation of cities. So I just wanted to contribute that today for the unlearning idea that we're sharing.
Michelle, just
Michelle.
as you just arrived, we're all going around talking about unlearning moments this week.
Talking about our learning moment, unlearning.
Unlearning
Got it.
moments,
Yeah.
And
It's
introducing
great to
ourselves.
see. It's great to see everyone. And Jarrett, I am thrilled to see you here. I'm excited to hear what you have to bring to the conversation. So
Thank you for the invite.
yeah. I lots of unlearning moments, Anna. We had lots of unlearning and learning moments during our open house. It was such a rewarding experience, humbling, like just to be kind of put in the spot of being the caretakers of these items, and navigating the busyness of like presenting things to a big public, and still it kind of warmed my heart, like that as we were leaving the room, as we were shutting everything down, somebody, I can't remember who, said goodbye to the artifacts and hope you had a good day, like that kind of thing. So in any case, yeah.
I can go next. Something that's been at the forefront of my mind for the second half of this week, I guess, is thinking about this notion that was related to the land grant discussion on Wednesday with Dr. Gavazi and his team and other Indigenous scholars and leaders. Dr. Stephen Gavazi brings to our attention this notion that we can be both land grant fierce as well as aware of the darker histories of Indigenous dispossession and genocide in relation to our campus. And I will share too this podcast that I was listening to. It's about, I think, like half an hour long, with Dr. Gavazi and another interviewer, where he explains this a little bit further. But I don't know if I don't think we can be land grant fierce and recognize land grab darker histories at the same time. I think we can have pride for a place, but I think there's a tension when we use the word land grant fierce. So this is a part of my unlearning for this week. And I'll put that link in the chat.
I just want to acknowledge, Anna, that I had a visceral response to that word, to the landgrass. Like, maybe I thought it was a cultural thing for me that, like, I think in the US there's this use of the word fierce that means something to do a bit like school pride, or I'm not really sure if I'm really understanding where that word comes from, but it seemed to, because I think it was land grab truth and land grant fierce, and so yeah, the irreconcilability would seemed kind of a problem. But I remember as we were watching this in class, I was kind of I tensed up and maybe even shouted or something at that moment. But anyway, so I'm just acknowledging that was a moment for me too.
I can share. So my unlearning this week has just been, I guess, more personal. So I was having a venting session with Anna right before everybody came on. But essentially I've been, and Richard knows this too, I've been adjusting to new medication that I've been put on for trauma recovery and ADHD as a new diagnosis, and having to adjust to something that I could have got help a lot earlier if I was diagnosed when I was younger. And so a lot of female-bodied people aren't diagnosed with ADHD at a young age. It's a pretty well-known psych history, dark history kind of situation. And so I have so many amazing projects and opportunities that I've been engaging with on campus, off campus, and other things that I've been trying to figure out how to live like my day to day with this new mental kind of awareness because of the calmness of the medicine I'm taking, but also the focus I'm able to have, where the creativity that usually would be there out of like an impulse is not really being generated. And so it's been much more of like nesting. We're in fall, right? So it's kind of a weird paradox to have this energy to focus and be stimulated in what I want to do, but everything around us is saying we need to nest and harvest to be ready for the winter. So I've been trying to figure out how I can really be in alignment with what is happening around as I adjust to this. And it has honestly been pretty difficult to get what I need to get done in the way that I want them to be done. I guess it's as simple as I can get it to be. So this kind of unlearning of my perfectionism, or not doing anything because I think it's not going to be the way I want it to, because I'm not as fully aware as all that my brain is able to do now, because I've been doing so much overwork over my 26 years with having to be used to one way in which my brain has processed something. So a lot of unlearning in terms of how to eat, what I eat, when I eat, my body's reacting, the nervous system is reacting. And so trying to take a lot of calm and care that I would with people that I work with for myself, and know that I don't have to hit a deadline to be successful, that me just taking care of myself is enough for right now. So.
I can go ahead and share a moment as well this week. So over the past couple of weeks, I've been reading a book about police violence in the US, and it talks a lot about the intersections with like settler colonialism, with the immigration system, racism and whatnot. And I think the one moment that I kind of want to dive deeper into is that I had years ago done some research on the idea of like queering immigration. So looking at how immigration systems treat different bodies differently. And a lot of the focus there was on the HIV ban in the US, which I think went out in like 2008, 2012, something like that. And so this book kind of highlights how that stole a lot of the attention, because it was oftentimes portrayed as like a gay, like cis male issue. And so that kind of, whenever applying like a queering lens to it, that was always what swept up all of the attention. And this book talks a lot about these different scholars that have done work on different ways in which trans women or lesbian women have been differentially policed through immigration systems. So that was just like a nice, I think, reminder of expanding kind of the queer lens when looking at immigration systems.
Thank you.
Kurt, we're just sharing unlearning moments, and I think you're last to go if you can. Over the last week, anything that struck you? Maybe Kurt's
Yeah, I think that
messages
Kurt
from work.
may just be listening, today.
Yeah,
so
that's fine. That's fine. Peter's joined us. We can ask Peter as well. That's fine, Kurt. That's great. That's great. Yeah, as we wait for Peter to join, I'll put some links to the
Here's Peter.
Yeah, the context that I was talking about as well into the chat as well. So Peter, welcome. We are all just sharing, just a way to get started today. And it was started before I arrived. So it is just sharing an unlearning moment this week, anything that's happened this week that has made you reflect, or, kind of jostle you out of a certain groove that you have been in, or something you've read, something you've watched, something that someone has talked to you about, anything that has just ruffled your feathers.
Yes, there was one thing. I've been reading a book on, it's not related to indigenous people, but it is about the hemmings of Monticello. And what surprised me, and I think that it applies to indigenous people as well, is that some groups, like African Americans, like indigenous, almost want to meld into white culture rather than fighting it. They say, I might as well disappear into white culture. And I was I don't know why I'd never noticed this before, paid attention to this before, but that the descendants of Sally Hemings were able to disappear into the whiteness of Ohio and the whiteness of Wisconsin, carry on their lives, and people around them had no idea that they were the offspring or the relatives of the concubine of Thomas Jefferson. And I was stunned by that. I thought that they would want to try to preserve their culture, and they said, we've given up. And I guess it's kind of a sad moment to think about, that they are defeated enough, not just because of slavery, but defeated enough that they go, I just can't fight this anymore. I might as well just disappear into whiteness. That I found really disturbing. That's it.
So maybe on that point, I mean, not exactly related, but I had an experience when I was working in East Texas among African American communities there, and I expected to see like a lot of white on black tension, in these areas. I mean, these are rural areas where there are people like riding horses in the streets, streets are unpaved, like that type of thing. So there are images that sort of you experience when you're there that seem sort of out of time, out of place. But another image that sort of stuck out for me was that there was a motorcycle that was lynched, basically. Like it was, I don't know what the significance of it was, but it was pretty shocking, to see that in this particular area. And when I got there, like I said, I was expecting those sorts of racial tensions, and instead, what I found was that there were a lot of tensions within the Black population itself, divided between people who wanted to move forward and not look back and reconcile with their historical past, like not even necessarily pass on the knowledge of that historical past to their children because it was too painful and traumatic. And then there were a different group of people who were intent on, preserving traditions and stories and art forms. So the conversations were very, very interesting, that this idea of how to move forward, either moving forward with the past, and appreciating the roots of where people came from, or moving forward in some form of separation, from their historical past. Just fascinating. I think that kind of comes up in many populations that have gone through different types of trauma, right? Different types of historical trauma. So
I think that's not unusual to find, not only among African Americans, but all groups that in one way or another have been ostracized and marginalized and discriminated. But it also happens within white people. I mean, why are we only focusing on that side of things? I mean, is there a unity among whites? Is there homogeneity among whites? It's not there. And some of them choose to neglect the past, and some others are active, questioning, criticizing. I think one thing that came to my mind is it's a little bit of a different sort of situation, but for some reason it just came to my mind, which is now, since about 2 years ago, there has been a lot of institutional interest in discussing issues of diversity, racism, and all these things. And, events are being organized. And what we notice, for example, where I work in my campus, is that it's almost always the case that whenever it comes to organize a panel, a webinar, a conversation, whatever, about these topics, it's almost always assumed and expected that it's people of color who have to be the ones talking, people of color who have to be the ones raising consciousness and bringing awareness. And I noticed that there's always this assumption that it's only, certain people who are supposed to take the lead. Whereas in my personal opinion, I think it's a whole issue of not only social justice, equality, but even citizenship. So white people should be at the lead as well, right, in these kinds of conversations. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that we would love to see always, this, people leading the movements and things, the ones who are being more affected by it. But in reality, that's not necessarily the case. And what you see is that their society, even within the expectations for social movements, there's an implicit assumption that certain people have to do it, right? And not everybody. It's like racism affects minorities, therefore minorities are the ones who have to do the movement. That's the kind of thing that came to my mind, which is not what you're saying, Michelle, but it just popped out like my unconscious association with the topic that we were discussing before. So I just wanted to point that out for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, perhaps along the lines of what I was saying in response to Peter's comment, just to think about this feeling like giving up, right? Like your discomfort, sensing that they had just given up and disappearing into whiteness, that we might conceptualize that as strategies for survival, strategies for reconciliation, strategies for thriving, like that type of thing, where people have to work with the circumstances that they're given and make decisions about how they move forward, right?
I'll also add to that. So like getting that on both sides of my family. So like similar time streams of slavery on my dad's side, and then you have all the native stuff on my mom's side, and then there's some things in my family's history where they did cross, and past grandparents and stuff, where this idea of whatever your specific cultural group is so confusing within the family, because like on my dad's mom's side, like she's from the islands. And so what that means could be many things for many people, whether you identify as Black or not. Some people don't use that terminology. You're just an islander, and that's just kind of how it is, but then if you're dealing with the descendants of slaves, they're very stereotypical West African story. Like I have a lot of African tribal heritage in my family, but that wasn't passed on to that because they couldn't maintain the language out of fear of death and all those many things. And so this idea of like disappearing into whiteness too, like my dad's side, we're literally the spectrum of color. Like you have like the like albino is in our family, all the way to the deep rich colors, especially for my grandma's side in the islands. And so this idea of who can disappear into whiteness, where they can be in spaces, especially in Ohio, and especially rural Ohio, or in urban Ohio, where you're kind of dealing with intercultural issues, I guess is the easiest way I can put it. It's this conversation of like, when I'm going out on my day to day, how can I survive? Right. So like if I go on the streets, my brother or my cousin can go out there and be fine, but my mom can't. And if you're doing that for many generations over and over and over, then it's like some people are going to decide like, I can't do the fight anymore because I'm tired. And so you have this knowing, like I know on my dad's side, there's this knowing of we are Black, we are proud, whatever. But to say that I'm Black and I'm proud vocally is just exhausting. And I just want to be able to do my day-to-day job. And that could be then matched to a lot of indigenous groups too. And I can only call for Turtle Island in the States, right? So it's this kind of like, what do you do in order to find like that survival situation, like Michelle is saying? And so sometimes it's not disappearing, it's just saying that I'm exhausted and I have to focus on my family. And sometimes other people who are cultural pillars in the communities, I'm handing that to them. And sometimes you just have to say, I can't do it anymore. Maybe when I'm an elder, I can do it, but I have to focus on having the money and the shelter for my children and my family and even my, parents or something. So, and like I said, I can only call for like the Black and Native experience. And so like what I've seen in both those communities from personal relationships or just being in cultural groups, there's this questioning of when you're on this land of Turtle Island and trying to deal with things happening so recently of having things being removed and displaced, then we're still all trying to figure out where our place is. And sometimes you even want to ignore the colonial stuff, even though it's always going to be there anyway. And you kind of do it in private, you do it in secret. You may have to get access to certain foods that aren't what your body can easily take, but you have to do it because of convenience and for financial reasons. And so having to adjust to the Western society when it may not be what your culture says you should be doing is sometimes you have to make those sacrifices to live in the day to day. So.
Indigo, I learned something from your mother at her presentation earlier this week, which was kind of a really interesting kind of preparation for Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think it was, so Shannon Gonzalez Miller, and it was about this question of invisibility as a strategy of survival. And I think she cited Brian Braybon for that. And I think this was specifically at the moment in educational context when Black and Indigenous students are called upon at moments of critical moments in the conversation, and that I think it was that question of and I think for educators that feels like a moment of, especially as a white educator, this feeling of like not wanting to, and actually, I mean, Anna, I have to say, practically it happens in our class, I feel, in relation to talking about indigeneity and knowing that you are in the class, and therefore at the same time not turning to you at moments, because the whole class is about the indigeneity, and therefore knowing that I want to acknowledge that you are there, but at the same time not burden you. And that's something that Indigo was just describing, that burden. So, and this links into some other theoretical stuff that I've been processing, which is Edouard Glissant's right to opacity, which is a kind of, I've actually just also come from a curriculum development program about courses in race, ethnicity, and gender diversity. And this idea of when we're creating curriculum, we have to be as transparent as possible. And it's such an important mechanism, especially for equity issues, like transparent curriculum, make sure there's no hidden curriculum, and make sure that assignments are evaluated. And then, but this idea of opacity, this kind of feeling of like, sometimes self-presentation can't be brought to environments when, anyway, it needs to be respected, and especially by white teachers with non-white students in the class. I think a right to opacity in that regard. But yeah, I don't know if your mum's session was recorded, Indigo. I need to find that out. But it was really timely, and I'm thinking a lot about Monday. And actually, I actually kind of want to spend some time today thinking about Monday. In terms of what people are doing, and I know, Indigo, you are organizing several things and part of several things, but I mean, I think also your mum referenced what allies and accomplices can do to support Indigenous peoples on this day, and I think we need to think about that too, rather than this kind of social media kind of fanfare situation. Sorry, a lot going on there.
Yeah, maybe on this note, Jarrett and I had a intense email exchange this week, And I could feel like the frustration in your email, Jarrett. You kind of get the sense that we're kind of like a little family, a little community here. We're all kind of in dialogue with each other outside of the Our Unlearning Hour. But I wonder if you're comfortable kind of sharing, where you work, what you do, how it might fit into these topics of like advocacy that Richard is talking about, and what the circumstance of your frustration was. This group may be able to help you brainstorm, on how to address this type of issue in the future, or how to formulate the arguments in a compelling way. Like I said, so I wonder. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it just seemed like a perfect segue.
Oh, absolutely. Quick question. Is the recording made like publicly available? Just so I know what level of detail to share in this.
It is, but we can, Jarrett, we can pause, and we can also, we can not list it. There are many ways to do this. So we have people in our community that like to kind of catch up with what we've been talking about, who can't make it to certain sessions. But we haven't tried the pause function. Maybe that's an idea. If that would be the best thing for you to, or if there's an overview that you think you can do in public view, then do that. But if you want me, I can press pause. Just let me know what you want me to do.
If that isn't too much of an imposition, or if it messes things up, then. But otherwise, I can give a more general overview.
That's fine, Jared. I'll just say to anyone watching this in the future that we'll catch up with you in a few minutes. This number thing. Anyway, I find it. I empathize with your frustration on that specific point, because there are reasons for this number, the small number, and those reasons are why that work needs to be done. And so, so that question.
What are some of the ideas for framing the relevance that you can think of? Just thinking about like how folks fall into describing or like framing the relevance of lesser taught languages at Ohio State, or taking a class that is on Indigenous cultures at Ohio State. And often what we hear, like the pat answer, is something about job preparedness, right? Or it often tends toward, this is a disappearing language or an endangered language, and therefore we need to sort of rescue it somehow and give it some sort of visibility. But those statements always feel like they fall short for me, and yet they're on the lips of most people. Like when prompted, the students will say this very often, and part of our task is to sort of like encourage them to think beyond that, like not in utilitarian terms, of how does learning this language serve us in our job position, but in other types of broader, more engaging terms with the cultures themselves. I'm just curious to hear, what some ideas would be.
Can I just speak from my positionality, which is coming from a former discipline, which was the studies of ancient Greek and Latin, where there was obviously a lot of, the discourse surrounding that discipline about, dwindling numbers of students reading the literature and the text in those languages, all this kind of panic around this. And the strategies that were mobilized there were about foundational, relations with other language, with Romance languages, these kinds of questions, to be able to, and so all the arguments used to defend those languages are the arguments that do not get employed to defend the teaching and the revitalization of, say, for example, indigenous languages. And that, so I see, the language revitalization. I mean, that's not a language that's used in those, I would call imperial languages or foundational imperial languages. And so I think it's like I get back to the kind of connection with the students and with the people in the classes that then, because this also bounds up with the crisis of Indigenous student representation at this university. The numbers have declined so much, and again to talk about numbers. Then there are still problems with programs, problems with all these kinds of questions, and the question is, do you try to? And this was part of the webinar earlier this week, was, do you try to revitalize the programs first and the numbers first, or do you try and get more students for these kinds of issues, when you need to be doing both things at the same time? And so and I think the other really big issue here is, and I think that this is when I joined K'acha Willaykuna as someone that didn't specialize in the fields of Andean and Amazonian indigenous arts and humanities. It was this rather naive but exciting feeling of, what would it mean for arts and humanities to be to be transformed by an attention to indigenous scholars, artists, activists, in a way that would actually, do all that revitalizing that there's always lamenting in the humanities, but through a perspective that actually revitalizes humans and communities as well. So, I think that could be a strategy, as it were, that it is, and I'm really feeling it in the Global Indigenous Arts class right now about, you can have a global arts class and you wouldn't get into the discussions that we're getting into in the Global Indigenous Art class about institutional colonialism and racism within a university. So it really is no matter about the numbers and the minor elements that might be kind of presented against it, I think the impact is so powerful. And I was at a panel the other day that was thinking about the way in which Indigenous presence has such an amazing impact beyond number. And that, I think, is something that I can speak to in my own transformation, and also in classrooms, and also in collaborations, and so I just think that there's definitely something that we can translate. I don't know the mechanism without telling a long story, but I do think that actually maybe telling a long story is the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. We will have to, because people forget easily, right, where we're coming from. Mm-hmm. I remember long time ago, I was in a talk where our colleague Michelle, you remember Maureen Ahern, she was talking about issues of conversion and language up in the northern frontier of Mexico. And then all her conference was about this one indigenous person who had this very proactive response to the missionary work. When the question and answer session started, this faculty from history, not by chance, one of the most senior faculty, he said, well, but what you're talking about, you're just talking about one person. How is that relevant? This is just one person, right? And then I'm thinking about how much have the fields, some fields, including history, have changed over time with this framework of decolonization and the critical approach to colonialism, because the numbers are not anymore at least in the new approaches to at least ethnohistory, for example, if you are to study indigenous peoples, you have to forget about those numbers that are collected, presented and tabularized and all those things. It's not about the numbers, because what matters is what people express and what people produce or generate or view. And history is one of those professions where numbers really count, right? Like the modern professional approach to history, it's based on numbers precisely, right? It's based on this idea of evidence and empirical evidence, and the new fields, like, for example, ethnohistory or cultural studies, or many fields are really doing away with that power of the number. There has to be a questioning of the power of the numbers in the humanities and the social science. Social science is huge also about numbers, right? But we need to really question that in terms of even colonialism, right? Not only because of the marginalization of those who are not well represented in the data, but also because some fields are really grounded in the idea of facts supported by empirical evidence, which is produced, but nobody questions where it was produced, right? And how it was produced and who produced it. So all those things bring to the conversation colonialism and how colonialism imposed a model of thinking and a model of knowledge production, right? So that was just my 2 cents very quickly.
I'll add too, I'm wondering if there's this, a lot of people who are doing this kind of work, whether, in some sort of POC related studies. Like, I don't know how to be more broad than that, because you can have that in all fields, medical, everything, So when you're kind of, oh, sorry. So yeah, so like, there's this urgency to try to like have people be supported, represented, not tokenized, but also be empowered. And there's this kind of like frantic trying to get things to be okay so everybody feels supported and loved and taken care of. But we're still, and I'll speak to the institution of like a university, we're still literally in structures that are created, structured, maintained in Western ways of being. And so a lot of the decolonizing work is saying, well, if I know this stuff, if I have these methodologies, or I'm in groups of people who know how to decolonize, then we should be able to do it in these spaces. But there will always be, there's a good generation of that like frustration to get things to happen, to have that like action to want to do it. But I believe, or I think we're still in the beginning stages of it, and to see the real turnover of things being where they want to be, I'm not sure if it's in like our lifetime, if it's maybe in like a couple more generations. And so I for sure, like in my undergrad, was really stressed out that there's so many things I need to get done within like, being alive for maybe till I'm like 85 or 90, right? Like this is such a short time span, and there's so many elders that are crossing over that I need to try to be connected with them so we can all do this work and then help the young ones do this work. And I had to give myself a real like really stop myself and say, it's okay that you won't be able to see it. And I think that's something that I really want, or I'm hoping a lot of people who are doing this work is to say, we're in the year 2021. You can add the quantitative methods of history to have like the data of during these time frames, these things have happened, but to understand that we may not be able to see the change and have to accept that so that we can do the actual work that is tangible, than having this like dream of if only this could happen, if only we had this thing, if only this would happen, then it'll be all better. Like that's not accepting like the moment to moment of the interaction with people you may encounter, where that could have that butterfly effect, And so like, and I've had some really intense conversations with some dear friends of mine where they're in their own, like biomedical fields, they're all doing stuff in Indian country where they're trying to support people on the res. But the question of like, okay, how much can I do in my lifetime, and having that weight put on us and then having other external forces saying like, this is what you have to do and all this stuff, it's so anxiety inducing that you just get paralyzed sometimes and you can't do it. You know, sometimes you just say, I can't, and I want to be able to see it. But if people are able to take that grieving process to say like, I'm okay with knowing that I won't be able to see it, but I'll do what I can, that might give some creative breathing room to do the work for those who are with us now, you know. And that to me is true Indigenous ways of knowing. If our ancestors hundreds of years ago did what they could during their lifetimes and did whatever they could to survive and maintain to bring us to where we are now, then we have to have that same mentality for, you know, 7 generations in the future, that what we're doing now is going to help them as much as we can, and no matter what is happening around us. And that's where I think the individual becomes very important, rather than, you know, one community has to do something for their community, and if you're not helping this community with their struggles and you're, you know, prejudiced towards them, that's just creating colonial tensions that have been going on forever, right? Putting us against each other. But knowing that, you know, this whole even belief system of, well, I have to do things now to be a savior of my people, or so that I get in good spirits with, you know, belief systems of the afterlife, that's also kind of having conflicts of what you're doing with your physical body and your mental capacity as of now. And we're also in the transition of being in a pandemic still to this day. And so we're having to learn, I think, also, I would love to know more about the histories over time in different parts of the world where what has happened to before there's been serious, I mean, not just like the Black Plague, but like serious illnesses that isn't just widely known in like History Channel. What happens in that transition of time, what became important, what became relevant, because we are literally having the gift of being able to change things because we're having to have a different way of doing things every single day. You know, and so that is where like you take in that grief of people who have transitioned because of this terrible pandemic, the frustration of people who are having this be perpetuated because of their ignorance and their own self-preservation. But then it's like, okay, well then what can I do so that I know that I can do things, take care of myself and my people, and not feel like I'm going to be burnt out, you know, on a regular Tuesday. You know, like what can I do so that institutions around me that don't want me to be here, I'm not going to say you're, you know, so Ohio State has its issues, but they also got money. And I'll be quite honest, they got money, you know, and now people are wanting to have things that are accessible to get programming, you go for it, you know. And sometimes there's times where a lot of POC people, even people on the gender spectrum and queer people, you know, I'm in all that. So there's sometimes you have to be like, I want to be a token so I can take that and help other people, and not feel guilty of saying like, I'm doing this because this is what I have access to. And people who have access to that and who are willing to provide that, that is something that is more active than dreaming and wanting for things to be better if only this could happen. You know, so what is actually tangible? And in the education system and institutional education systems, you are able to be creative, and that's how you decolonize, right? It's not a matter of I have to fit in this system, therefore it's fighting against me, which is true, but how can I be creative and including my indigenous ways of knowing or whatever cultural ways of knowing that you already know in your body to have it be taken care of for the long term. So that's what I'm sharing.
Yeah, I love sort of the fluidity of what you're saying, Indigo, you know, and it kind of brings me back to something that I've been thinking a lot on in these last couple of weeks, which is this idea of like coalitions, right? And maybe to add your words, like creative, strategic coalitions that don't just assume, you know, that somebody has to have like a one-track politics or, you know, that type of thing, but that can pivot, you know, in productive ways, in fruitful ways, in order not to get stuck, not to get discouraged, not to get isolated. The other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking, and then also as Alcida was talking, is that these strategies of isolation. So the value of the individual, we have that on one end, right? We have the history as an institution, as a field, with an emphasis on numbers, you know, and sort of like the colonial imposed model of knowledge production that Alcida was talking about, right? And then we also have, you know, that in the process of us celebrating things like diversity and saying none of these populations are homogenous, and we have to recognize the individuality, you know, and individual agency within groups, that it is a colonial strategy to fragment and isolate and to present things as if they were personal pathologies, right? As opposed to looking at like a social context that generates, you know, certain circumstances under which people operate. So that's really tricky, right? Thinking about like the power of the individual, the power of the narratives, but then on the other end of things, potentially that isolating tendency. I don't know what to make of. I mean, I know what to make of it. It's a long discussion, but I'm just, I'll just put that out for the group. Oh, and one more thing is I wanted to make an announcement before our time runs out, is that today, Elvia Andia, our K'acha professor at Ohio State, is doing a presentation on her award-winning book. It's a bilingual book that she wrote and won the Juan Poma de Ayala Literature Prize in Bolivia. It's at 4 o'clock and it's going to be in Haggerty 160. And she has free copies of the book available for those of you who might be interested. So please come out and support if you happen to be on campus and are available.
So Michelle, that's not going to be broadcast through Zoom or anything like that? No.
No, it's in person, yeah.
In person. Okay. I just wanted to thank Indigo for your candid comment and for expressing yourself freely. And I just simply want to say one thing: you don't have to do everything. Okay? We don't have to do everything ourselves. I mean, it's a multiple effort, and whatever our ancestors have done, they have not done it individually. You know, it's because they were in community. So thank you for reminding me that is the case, because I sometimes feel like you, right? I feel like you. I have to be responsible to me, to my group, to my class, to my students, to my everybody. And then what am I going to do? But let's just remember, we don't have to do everything ourselves. We do what we can, and our first responsibility is with ourselves. So I think that's what I wanted to say before, I guess we're running out of time.
Well, we've reached our hour. I'm always the person that has to remind us of this. I'm always the person that there's something in me that makes me feel like I'm the person that has to remind us of this. So again, thank you for sharing space to get today. It may just be 1 hour, but it's very significant. And it does accumulate for those of us that attend regularly, or those of us that watch when the person that puts them on YouTube gets around to putting them up on YouTube. And that's addressing myself. But yeah, just, I don't know, just, I think that focus on caring for ourselves is very important, but also, you know, that I really want it, that resonating, this idea that if we're not around to see it, if we can, you know, the cracks in the institution that we can kind of pour water into, I think is really, you know, really, really important. And we're in it, and we're in it, right? We're in this. We're not kind of coming to it, you know, by being in this space, we are in it. And I think that how do we widen this space? How do we invite people into this space? You know, what are those mechanisms? How do we share? And I think, you know, Peter, you being here because your daughter's here, you know, I mean, Jarrett, you coming from this conversation with Michelle, like we're doing it, we're widening, you know, so I really hope that in that spirit, we can just keep doing that. Although at the same time, sometimes when it's just 3 of us, it's fun too. So it's either way, but it is a space and a space for us to process and think together. So yeah, happy Friday, everybody. And I will see you next. Well, no, we won't do next week because we'll probably have a break next week because, well, no, we can talk about it. We're on institutional break at OSU. I'll be camping I don't know if I can do it while camping. We'll see. But I don't have to be here if people want to continue. I mean, the link's there. So anyway, I will stop the recording now and then close things down. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was great to see